with extreme climatic conditions as the norm, and an ice sheet cover averaging over a mile in thickness. Antarctica is a truly peculiar continent. The continent's geographical isolation, relatively late discovery, extreme conditions, and untarnished features all set it apart from its continental brethren. The goal of the paper that I'm discussing today was to achieve a better understanding of the many difficulties the international community has faced trying to apply traditional international concepts and principles to the continent of Antarctica. To achieve that end, in my report, I basically examined Antarctica's unique geography and particular historical circumstances and found out which ones were responsible for, its current state of perplexity. I used sources that date from Antarctica's discovery in the 19th century all the way to the present day. And the ultimate goal of my report was to explain Antarctica's inherent incompatibility with the basic precepts that define territorial areas and international law. For centuries, much of the Western world believed in the existence of this mythical southern continent that laid south of the known world. They even had a name for it. They called it Terra Australis. That was Latin for South Land, which makes sense. The continent was first hypothesized in antiquity and then later included in maps beginning in the 15th century, until obviously the eventual discovery of Antarctica in the 19th century. The map that you see in front of you is actually from 1570, and it depicts Terra Australis, or Australia as we know it today, as this large continent on the bottom of the world. And what's really amazing about this is it was drawn 200 years prior to the actual discovery of the continent. Now, what's particularly interesting about this map of the world is its author and where it was found. This map, Typus Orbis Terrarium, was actually authored by a famous cartographer and geographer named Abraham Ortelius. Now, Abraham Ortelius also wrote what's considered to be the first true modern atlas, and that's where this map was found. Now, before the exploration of Antarctica, the most basic questions about the continent remained unanswered. People didn't know what the weather was like. They didn't know if there were any vegetation, any animals. They didn't even know if there was any land to land their boats on. So what the U.S. Navy did in 1838, they sent off a 4-year expedition to explore the continent. And they did so under the command of Officer Charles Wilkes. After Wilkes returned back to America in 1844, he published his personal day-by-day account of what happened during the exploration. And he also included several sketches like the one you see on the screen right now. These really give you excellent first-hand experience of what it really felt like to land on the continent for the first time and his perspective. Now I would like to share with you what I extrapolated from Wilkes' sketch, obviously illustrating his perspective upon first landing on the continent. Now firstly, you could see the numerous icebergs surrounding the continent. Now these depict how difficult and dangerous the journey to land must have been for these early Antarctic explorers. After all, as you can see in the picture, they're traveling in 19th century wooden boats. From this perspective, you can actually see the planting of a flag atop the highest accessible peak. Now this represents early attempts by explorers to claim parts of Antarctica on behalf of their home country. And obviously the Americans were no different. Now from this perspective, you can see an uncomfortable sailor sitting by himself, just with the look of misery on his face. I think Wilkes was trying to illustrate just how harsh the Antarctic environment really was. Now this is a photograph of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, an experienced polar explorer who in 1938 commented on his own personal experience on the continent. He commented, quote, "I felt as though I had been plumped upon another planet or into another geologic horizon of which man had no knowledge or memory." Those alien-like conditions Byrd described really played a tremendous role in shaping Antarctica's rich and complex legal history. Those same unique characteristics also render Antarctica largely incompatible with the traditional methods of acquiring sovereignty. Prior to its discovery in the early 19th century, the continent had never been previously subject to a sovereign power. Using legal terminology, the continent was terra nullius, which is Latin for land belonging to no one. Now, the traditional method of establishing sovereignty over land that is terra nullius is pretty much common sense. One would obviously first have to discover land that belonged to no one. They would then naturally take possession of that territory. And finally, they would acquire sovereignty over that territory through its effective occupation. However, Antarctica's unique geography presents certain challenges and potential legal uncertainties regarding a claim to first discovery. One such challenge, posited by historian Peter J. Beck, is the possibility that some early explorers might have mistakenly claimed icebergs instead of continental land. So, given such a challenge, how does one authenticate an alleged discovery, given the vague and incomplete evidence available? The requirements to achieve an effective occupation posits an even greater challenge to acquiring sovereignty in Antarctica. After all, how could a claimant even effectively occupy Antarctica? It's a place with an inhospitable climate that makes long-term occupation practically impossible. During the Cold War, political and military tensions between the Western Bloc powers, which was the United States and its allies, and the Eastern Bloc powers, which were the Soviet Union and its allies, meant that any international misstep could result in an all-out war between the two sides. In the decades following World War II, there existed a massive dispute about sovereignty in Antarctica. There was fear that the long-lasting territorial rivals shown in this illustration could end up in armed conflict between each other, which would likely result in yet another proxy war between the United States and Russia. It was therefore imperative for peacekeepers from both sides of the conflict to come to an agreement in order to limit the scope of the Cold War battlefield for everyone's sake. And both sides did come to an agreement, as the Antarctic Treaty was signed by 12 nations in 1959 and successfully prevented Antarctica from being drawn into the wider East versus West conflict of the Cold War. However, instead of permanently resolving Antarctica's territorial disputes, the Antarctic Treaty sets the sovereignty issue aside altogether. It instead relies on Article 4 of the treaty to maintain peace. Article 4 enables all Antarctic Treaty partners to retain their respective legal positions while maintaining a peaceful coexistence amongst all treaty partners. In order to maintain a peaceful coexistence, Antarctic sovereignty was both figuratively and fittingly put on ice, a moratorium that remains in effect to this day, as Antarctica's clock is effectively permanently frozen in place, stuck on June 23, 1961. Article 4 has been portrayed as the cornerstone of the treaty by some, and as the purgatory of ambiguity by others. But in my opinion, both are equally true.